I now call on Mr Hayes.
Thank you. Mr President, congratulations, honourable members, especially new members. I grew up in Brighton, the son of a doctor and a school teacher, so in many people's eyes I had a life of privilege. But my parents had just bought a house, my father was starting his own medical practice from scratch, and I was sent to Gardenvale State School, but I didn't like school, particularly getting the strap in my first few days there for playing in the third graders' playground. So when I learned to read quite well, I told my mum I wanted to leave school. She laughed and she told me I had to do another 12 years before I could leave. I was devastated. You know, by grade 3, my parents were able to send me to Brighton Grammar, but in grade 4, my father suffered a terrible car accident which affected him and his earning ability for the rest of his life. Mum worked, which was not that common in the early 60s, and Dad brought in some money, so we got by okay. My 2 sisters and I managed to finish private schools, but my father's situation got worse, and he relied on drinking and heavy medication, which by the end of our schooling left him totally incapacitated. Now, being a bit of a rebel and not a great student, I decided on a very different course to the academic life so beloved of my parents. I'd become interested in photography and filmmaking, and to my parents' horror, I wanted a career in the film industry. So I left home and I went to work. The Australian film industry was almost non-existent then. I found a job in the nascent television industry with Hector Crawford at Crawford Productions in Collins Street. My first job was on Homicide as a music editor, although I only had the vaguest idea of what that job entailed when I started. Over the next few years, Crawford's produced the top 3 or 4 highest rating TV dramas in Australia at that time. I went on to become a freelance film editor, and in 1979 I won an AFI award for my part in editing Mad Max 1.
Can we hold the applause? It's tempting as it is, can we hold the applause till the end?
Thanks, King. However, it was my experience while working in the Northern Territory on the feature film We of the Never Never that changed my view on how we treated the first inhabitants of this land, and I came home a firm believer in Aboriginal land rights. My parents, particularly my father, who was a keen advocate to the few who would listen back then for Indigenous recognition and other social issues, were both academic and left-wing in political inclination, which was a pretty unusual stand compared to many of my friends' parents in Brighton. So I was always interested in politics and comparing and arguing various points of view. However, it was travelling overseas for 6 months when I was 24 which opened my eyes on how we lived in Australia. I was trying to find my way around the gridlock streets of Bangkok, and looking over a bridge I saw swarming below a mass of humanity living in shacks on the side of a city canal, which would be no bigger than our Elwood Canal down our way. A couple of hundred people were living down there, working, living and laughing. I realised there were many ways to live the life that I thought was normal from my little bubble in suburban Melbourne. I also realised that which so many Australian travellers come to see, we're all so enormously privileged to grow up and live in the open spaces and remaining nature of our suburbs and the surrounding countryside. I lived in Sydney for a while, working as an editor. Here I was in the heart of the film industry and lived the life of a continual after-work party. Restaurants, bars, parties, picnics, drinking, eating and all that goes with it. It was the 1980s and Sydney was a beautiful city and definitely the place to be. Few would disagree that most of the beauty around the harbour has now been spoiled by overdevelopment. I got married and divorced in fairly quick succession. I bought an old farmhouse in a small town, Deans Marsh, between Geelong and Lorne as a weekend retreat, and I became more and more interested in small-scale farming, self-sufficiency, agriculture and alternative lifestyles. I got married again and we had a daughter, followed by a son a couple of years later. Computerisation had swept through the TV industry, enabling me to work from our farmhouse, but often requiring travel back and forth to Melbourne. I studied for a diploma in applied science farm management by correspondence through Melbourne University with a view of starting a small vineyard, which would certainly supplement my growing wine cellar. And that was when devastation struck and my life had to change. My wife wanted out, citing my lifestyle, the working, the drinking, the parties, and generally being away from home too much. I wasn't much use as a father, and what's more, she was taking the kids. My drinking, smoking and party life had to stop. I realised my health was being affected and my lifestyle was costing me more than money. I was losing friends, my lucrative business, and now what I valued most, my family. I sought help and I found it through an organisation which pointed me to a path of spiritual recovery. As a result, I now no longer drink or smoke, nor do I take any mind-altering substances, except caffeine, and have not done so for many years. However, I did start that small vineyard on the Mornington Peninsula with a business partner. After a while, I managed to reconcile with my family, and though my wife and I did not resume our marriage, we became good friends, and I had the opportunity to be the father I'd always wanted to be to my children. In 2003, I sold the vineyard and moved back to Brighton again, buying an older style apartment with a backyard, where I still live today. While always having a political interest, my real political activity was about to start in a most unlikely way. My mother, who still lived in the old family home nearby, told me that a developer had plans to build a 5-storey building of more than 100 apartments right behind her house. The whole street was affected, most of the houses being single-storey. All our neighbours were up in arms. They can't do this here. And the reply from our council, oh yes, they can. It was Melbourne 2030 and we'd been declared, without our knowledge, to be living in an activity centre. What's more, the council had plans for more 4 and 5-storey buildings scattered around North Brighton. Our group of residents decided to run someone against the local councillor. I was the only volunteer and I ran on the issue opposing high-rise development. With huge community support, I was elected by a sizable majority seeking to maintain our village character. Once elected, I had the full support of council in moving for more restrictive height controls in our village-style shopping centres and surrounding residential streets. The Minister, through his department, would not allow the changes, but after much lobbying, he did grant so-called discretionary height controls, but at heights greater than the council's decision. The developers were still not happy and took the council to VCAT, where the VCAT member overruled the council's refusal, saying discretionary controls gave him the discretion to break them. What's more, he and other members over the years took it upon themselves to give council lectures about our housing policy, developed out of widespread community consultation, for being too restrictive. VCAT continues to grant permits for building heights far in excess of our meaningless discretionary controls as granted by the state government. So much for the wishes of the community or democracy, where elected bodies such as municipal councils can be overridden by a bureaucrat and increasingly by the state government. This is where I discovered the general attitude of the planning bodies. Senior planners in the government said to me, "Councillor, if you don't want high-rise, you must want sprawl." "I don't want either." To which they replied, "Well, where will you put the population?" Research showed me how population growth had been ramped up in recent years from a long-term average of 70,000 per annum to 200,000 people per annum. Melbourne is now growing by 2,500 people a week, seeking accommodation every week. This fact is used by government to overpower councils on the issue of planning in particular. Most government planners advocate urban consolidation and the destruction of our valued Australian suburban life. They talk of high-rise schools. Where will the children play? To achieve this so-called consolidation, governments, planners and developers want to bring in more and more people, but not from the outer suburbs, but from overseas to densify the inner city. Who benefits? The developers and the property industry. After being elected Mayor of Bayside, I joined an organisation called Planning Backlash. Led by the awesome Mary Drost OAM, we represented planning groups with similar issues all across Melbourne and regional Victoria. This group has led the campaign for greater say for residents and councils and has regularly met with all planning ministers, both Liberal and Labor, up to this minister, who no longer consults with us. Rapid population growth has been connected with our planning problems, and around this time I saw Dick Smith's documentary and found the policies of Sustainable Australia. I came to see that global population growth, the corresponding increased pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, species decline and habitat destruction made population growth the major environmental problem, both globally and locally. Yet population growth was not even mentioned by the major political parties, including the Greens. The Greens advocate lowering consumption, and rightly so, but until they realistically tackle the population issue, they cannot address the current rate of environmental destruction and greenhouse gas emissions in this state or in this country. This issue has nothing to do with race or religion, nor should it. For no matter how much we reduce consumption and the ensuing pollution per person, if we increase the population at the same time, we make zero or even negative progress. And we, in this country, are growing at rates far above world population growth, and our greenhouse gas emissions keep rising. A similar charge could be made against the major parties, Labor and Liberal, who cry economic ruin if we reduce population growth by returning to the 1980s or 1990s levels of immigration, as our party advocates. They say the current rapid population growth raises GDP, yet, as we all know, GDP per head of population growth and wages growth have been stagnant over recent years as we import more and more workers. In 2010, I met William Burke and joined Sustainable Australia. Their policies on local planning, affordable housing, infrastructure, the environment and a more diverse economy appealed to my frustrated desires, particularly at a local level. As to planning in this beautiful city and this bountiful state, planning should be a good thing, not like here with our planning system, deregulated, discretionary and encouraging the atrocious. Then we, the residents, hopefully with the support of our councils, try to make the proposal less bad. Even this process is under attack, with planning bodies such as the Grattan Institute seeking to remove third-party appeal rights. Even less democracy, even less local democracy is being demanded. Planning, we believe, should be conceived at the local level, initiated by local planning groups or citizen juries. Planning should then set the agenda, set the social and environmental goals, the population density and height controls. Then developers would have to conform to these established local requirements, the democratic process. Now, finally, just before I finish, I'd like to thank a few people who helped me take this journey to find my way to this most historic and honourable chamber. William Burke, our hard-working federal president and an invaluable mentor. Mary Drost, of indomitable spirit and the Committee of Planning Backlash. Richard Rosen, my supporters in Brighton Residents for Urban Protection. Derek, Evelyn, Kerry, David, Beth, David and John of Restore Residents' Rights. Jill Quirk, who ran in an election with me. Calvin Thompson, a former MLA and an early advocate on population growth, who's now my fantastic Chief of Staff. Noel Pullen, a former MLC who helped us in the planning battle. Alex Del Porto, James Long, Sonia Castelli and Bayside councillors past and present. My family, especially my two children, Alice and Harry. My objective, with your help, honourable members, is to make Melbourne and even Victoria a great place to live. Not merely a great place in population size or area to rival such places as Shanghai, New York, London or Sao Paulo. Such greatness would be mere obesity with all the disadvantages of such. not a city or a state where people are crammed into dog box apartments, living on crowded and congested streets in an environmentally unfriendly concrete heat island, but a spacious city with open skies, open and tree-filled streets with gardens. An environment where children can play safely, where the car is not king but a servant, walkable patchworks of various styles of housing where one would enjoy walking, cycling or travelling through by public transport. A city of learning, education, the arts and self-supporting industry where families and communities can thrive. Where the less fortunate, who may be living on lower incomes, are not segregated into high-rise towers, but can live in affordable, detached or medium-density housing spread throughout the suburbs. Where their children can have the same opportunities as other children, where ghettos of crime and despair are not created. A city where the environment, the living environment, is prized and of prime importance. A sustainable city or cities in a sustainable state. This can only happen when people are proud of their neighbourhoods, where they as citizens have control over what they create, the built form, the environment, the infrastructure. This is what I believe, as a parliament, we can achieve. Thank you very much.